Well, okay. So this morning we're on lesson number 83 of the workbook of A Course in Miracles, and it is another review lesson. It's the review lesson for lessons number 65 and lesson number 66. Lesson 65, my only function is the one God gave me. And 66, my happiness and my function are one. It's interesting was as I was reading these, and we're in the midst of lessons that speak over and over again about the idea of us having a function. And, you know, and people are always asking. I mean, one of the things, one of the great questions becomes, well, what's my function in the plan? What's my function in the plan? What is my function in the plan? How do I find out what my function is in the plan? And I think if you're doing these lessons, and as it says in the introduction to these lessons, as we do these lessons, there's a message waiting for each one of us personally, within our hearing, within our listening to these lessons as we read them. The ability to read and listen to what you're saying is something that I think must be developed in order for these lessons to begin to have the efficacy that they can. In other words, you can just go along and read these lessons and read them, and as we read anything else, or you can read them and allow yourself to hear the words that it is that you're reading to yourself, which is something I've always said. When you begin to, the moment you wake up, it's because you've heard yourself. You've heard the truth of yourself. You've heard the truth as being total. You've heard your ability to be perfectly true, and that allows you to wake up. Or you hear the ability, the totality of the falseness of your own sort of rhetoric, and get so sick and tired of living a lie that you have no choice but to wake up out of it. But I know awakening is based on being able to hear yourself. And there's no better way to hear yourself than to practice listening to yourself as you read these lessons. You're reading these lessons to yourself so that yourself can get an understanding that you're thinking along the lines that are no longer defending its ability to rise, but are opening your mind through the listening to your own reading of the lessons in where a form of safety, and surety and certainty, not in what we previously thought was our purpose in the world and how we understood the world, but in this new recognition of a purpose that we share with God, and the function that we all have within both God's creative universe and the plan for salvation. If you began to think of God as an activity rather than a static condition of something that we're striving to attain, if you began to think of God as the totality of the activity of what creation is, and even if we thought about that in human terms, if God is the totality of the reality of a ever creating, eternal, and infinite creative engine, then we are one of, let's call it, the parts that functions to allow that engine to fulfill its function. So therefore we have a function within the functioning of the engine of creation, which is what God is. We have a function to fulfill in the engine that we call creation. And no one can fulfill that function but us, because there is no one to fulfill that function but us, but me, but you. Wherever it is we are functioning within the totality of that creative engine in its ability to create. And if you are part of that, and it's got a sole purpose, a single purpose, then your purpose must be the same one that the overall creating functioning engine is serving. So you have a function. I have no function but the one God gave me. This recognition releases me from all conflict, because it means I cannot have conflicting goals. And the truth is, it also means that you cannot have a goal that conflicts with your brother's function either, because your brother's function is exactly the same as yours is, except your brother's function is his within the totality of the functioning engine of creative reality, and yours is yours. Now, it's not that they're different, it's just that you have been given a means to fulfill it as your brother has, and there's no need for change in you other than a change in mind. It's just simply changing your mind about your own purpose by glimpsing the totality of the reality of what that ever creating engine is, and seeing that you cannot not be separate from it. So therefore you must have a function within it that allows it to continue to do what it's always done and always will do. With only one purpose, I am always certain what to do, what to say, and what to think. All doubt must disappear, and I acknowledge that my function is the one God gave. As I acknowledge that my function is the one God gave me. And if everybody has a God-given function, then everybody is functioning for the same purpose, for the single purpose of making manifest God, creation itself. Here, it seems to be hidden by a dream, by the form the dream is taking. So the function that is the same action of mind in the dream, we call forgiveness, will eventually allow us to understand the nature of creation as being our function in reality, because they are not separate actions of mind, they are the same action of mind. One is just reparative to restore us to the understanding of what reality is and what creation is. That's forgiveness. And the other, creating, is the function that God gave us along with Him to ensure that His creating would have a purpose not separate from His, and yet there'd be an extension to it, and that extension is you. You are the extension of reality. And you're designed and to function so as to create an ever-continuing extension of that reality. You don't have to worry about what it is, which sometimes becomes a great preoccupation, trying to figure out what that is based on thinking about the world the way we've been thinking about it. And you can't get there that way. But you can get there by learning to train your mind. Here's a good indication in one of little commentary, more specific applications of this idea might take these forms. My perception of this does not change my function. So when you've come to recognize what your function is, even conceptually, when you come to recognize what your function is, when you run across a perception that doesn't seem to be in line, and in your perception, when you run across a perception that you're having that doesn't seem to be in line with what you think your function is, you can be sure that it's not the perception that can inhibit you from fulfilling your function, but it's simply your choice as to whether you fulfill your function or not. So my perception of this does not change my function. It doesn't matter what it looks like. God gave us a single function, and that single function is the only one we need to be concerned about, and the only one we need to master. And because that mastery of that function within, let's call it, the idea that our perceptions aren't giving us a reflection of the fulfillment of that function, or even the fact that anything is functioning that way. So if I in the sentence here, my perception of this does not change my function, your ability to decide to fulfill your function, even in, let's call it, the shadow of the fact that your perception of it doesn't seem to align with the fulfillment of your function, is how the integration of your ability to know your function and the willingness to fulfill it only begin to take place in you, and how you can see that the joy of the kingdom is always yours in the fulfilling of your function, in spite of what the situation may seem to call for or look like. And that's how we're having a conversation, how integration takes place. The integration takes place not in the realization of it transcendently, because you can realize something transcendently and it just serves, the ego will use it to continue to judge you and divide your mind. The integration of it takes place when the idea that comes from the light, that bright idea that dawns on you in the moments of transcendence, becomes applicable and useful in the world of space and time. That's when we begin to align and converge on the will of God as being our only will as well, even within the illusion of space and time. That's when we begin to prove to ourselves that heaven and earth no longer have to exist as separate states in our mind. The ability for one to present us with a perception that is not in line with what we think reality is or what our function is, and yet be willing to allow our function to not be altered by that perception, is a great step in our learning, because we have learned to not forget in the midst of the condition of forgetting, which is the consciousness association that this world, in a sense, has been composed of. The forgetting of reality, the forgetting of our function, the forgetting of who we are, and the necessity to be born again into all of those. So that, to me, is a good sign. It's a good sign if you have a perception that is not in line with the fulfillment of your function, and yet you're willing to go ahead and fulfill your function in spite of the perception that you're having, because it's showing you, it's demonstrating to you your ability and desire to no longer serve two masters and to seek ye first the kingdom, where previously the kingdom you thought may have been denied to you for any number of reasons. There's another one. This does not give me a function other than the one God gave me. There's no situation that you could find yourself in that can cause you to not have the function that God gave you, because God is in everything you see, because God's in your mind. So before, there seemed to have been a conflict between what was going on in the world and what you were learning. This is how the conflict is resolved, through the application of the single purpose that you're beginning to glean in your transcendent moments, when you leave behind the ways of the world and begin to recognize there's only one reality. Let me not use this to justify a function God did not give me. So it's interesting that how he says, this recognition, I have no function but the one God gave me. This recognition releases me from all conflict, because it means I cannot have conflicting goals. It's interesting that the examples that he uses of the best times for the more specific application, rather than understanding the generalized theory conceptually, the best times for the more specific applications of these come in moments where there seems to be a conflict appearing between what the world is presenting you and what your function actually is within the world. As a creative principality in the reality of the kingdom of heaven. You are that. You cannot not have a function separate from that, because there is nothing separate from that. And in fact, that's all that's happening. Even the dream of separation, even this dream of death, could not have the ability to have been dreamt without there being a reality behind the dreaming. And the reality behind the dreaming is always, in a sense, being mirrored in the opposite negative way in the dream of space and time. Then when it's known clearly and directly in the reality of the kingdom. And that's the way we can begin to look at the illusion, at the reflections that we're getting from the projected imagery of our own mind. The projected imagery of denial denies reality is true in every way. So what we get is an image of that denial being unlike reality in every way, and that's how we can come to utilize it to begin to understand reality. To begin to not be afraid of reality, we begin to recognize that the illusion is unlike reality in every way. So that when we look at perceptions, let's say, my perception of this does not change my function. When we look at a perception that seems to be unreal when we compare to what we know of reality in every way, that would be the most advantageous time to fulfill our function, which is the utilization of our mind along the lines of the reason God gave us or created us as a soul with the attributes of mind and heart. So that we begin to change our understanding so we're no longer afraid of our own thinking, and therefore we're no longer afraid of God, which is the engine by which we think. If you're afraid of your own thinking, you must be afraid of the source of those thoughts. When you stop being afraid of your own thoughts, then you stop being afraid of the source of those thoughts. Since we all have a single source, and then we're sourced in God, then we stop being afraid of ourselves. We stop being afraid of God. As above, so below, as within, so without. And my happiness and my function are one. We've been told over and over again in the Course itself, in the text, that the only joy, all joy, comes from doing God's will. Because God's will for us is perfect happiness, perfect peace. And as we read, joy is attendant to peace. There's no peace without joy. And you can't have real joy without peace, without experiencing the peace of God, which passeth the egoic understanding. So therefore, is not something that can be understood in the terms of the world's thinking of what peace would be and should be and how it looks. My happiness and my function are one. All things that come from God are one. They come from oneness and must be received as one. Fulfilling my function is my happiness because both come from the same source. And I must learn to recognize what makes me happy if I would find happiness. It's about as Socratic as you could possibly get. So if you're created with a function, and that function is literally to complete the function that God is the engine of, which is creation, and you're created to extend His creative reality as your own creative reality along with your brothers, then you're understanding the single nature of the activity of whole perfect mind. And your function cannot not be out of alignment with that reality. So that at any point in time, in spite of all the perceptions that may be seem to be coming at you, you cannot not begin in any given moment to desire to fulfill your function, and then begin to see your way clear and clearly as to how that function can be fulfilled in that instant. And no one can do that but you, because no one is facing the situation the way you are facing it, the same way as you are, from the same perspective, let's say. There's a teacher, Candace O'Denver, and she teaches that within consciousness all perspectives are contained, and that's much the same way within reality. Each one of the facets that we are of the extension of that reality, while it functions the same way, it shines light in a slightly different direction, so that the totality of the direction of all the facets that are shining the single light make up the reality of creation as we will come to know it, and as we can know it right now when we fulfill our function.